as well as maybe for a bit of applied science stuff. But this is a talk that's about related to my experiences of creating a survey system. So I'll start off with a bit of an advert. We've got this system that provides a bit of bread and butter income, but the bread and butter's gone a bit stale really. It's kind of 10 years old, Perl. We're rewriting it into Django. And so I'm going to cover the basics of how we developed an authorization system for this. First of all, actually covering open authorization standards for the web a little bit, how they work, what standards, what tools there are for Django to use to plug those in, and then how I'm currently developing it, because it's still kind of a work in process. So that's the details of the survey system. The bit I'm covering, as I said, will just be this little bottom section here to do with the authorization. There's a lot of interesting stuff with Cassandra and things at the back, but we haven't done enough of that for me to certainly talk about it to any of you lot. So, starting off, what do I mean by federated authorization? So, with federated authorization, I mean that the actual access control rights are being given to a web application from a remote identity provider. So your web application, to get straight into the terminology, is the service provider, and the remote logins are the identity providers, IDPs. They not only provide authentication of login, but can also potentially provide authorization. So there tends to be two ways that that's done. There's either authorization based on a sort of application to application level. What people will be familiar with is OAuth, where you have a kind of fixed scope, either of release of data about the person or of actual access control, but it will be fixed for that application, provides that fixed authorization to users that are coming in from the identity provider. Or there's the more flexible standards where entitlements can be set differently on different users by the identity provider. And those are, the protocols for those are SAML 2, a form of which Shibboleth is quite well known, or Windows WS Security. I call it Windows WS Security because it's kind of a standard, but it's only Windows and IBM that use it, so it's a sort of small standard. So what am I hoping this will do for my users? So to start off with, the idea is that they're going to be out in their, either their companies or their institutions, and they just use their standard local login. The people in the institution will be able to allocate which members of their staff have rights over access to our application. And they'll be able to do that, hopefully with their own group management system. If they're a fairly well-organized organization that's got identity management stuff in place, then they should have not only perhaps a single sign-on centrally, but also central groups management that can allocate access to different applications across what we call the enterprise, I guess. So I'm hoping that all that will seem quite seamless. It will be like they're just doing stuff with a local application. I mean, if we wrap our application in their look and feel, they might not even realize they're using somebody else's stuff. So with federated authentication, referring back to OAuth, it doesn't assume federated authorization doesn't assume federated authentication too. So just because you may be giving access rights with a certain protocol, it doesn't mean that that has to deal with the login. So OAuth can use a local login, but still be set up to give access rights. So if I start the first part of the talk, it's going to deal with the details of how this all works. So initially you have something at a network level. You've got central network kind of sign-on as a start, and then probably the most widely adopted one, Kerberos, which interestingly was invented around the time that Python was invented at MIT as part of Project Athena, I think it was called, and they did X Windows, and they came up with Kerberos. And that implementation, the principles behind it of key exchange and tokens, and most of the principles used in that are exactly the same principles that are used in all the web level authorization and authentication standards today. And so it was only much later that Windows, I guess, had issues with Windows NT LAN Manager, and they switched to Kerberos to be more secure. And then with a single sign-on, we have the wrapper for these kind of network logins that's happening at a web level, where you're transferring that authorization via HTTP or well-encrypted HTTP. And there's a couple of standards for that are just doing authentication. So OpenID is the well-known one, perhaps, although it tends to be used between different organizations and used for, say, lots of these social websites. And then Central Authentication Service is one that's perhaps only known if you're in a large institution where you set up a centralized web authentication between all your applications and use that. So there's loads of versions of SAML 2 because it's kind of a standard rather than a particular implementation. So we've got a Google version, and that's because SAML's more secure than using OpenID. And you've even got a recent one by somebody who used to work at Bristol Uni, which is a wrapper which directly talks to Kerberos and does ticket exchange, but via SAML. And then you have the Liberty Alliance, which are more about setting up authorization policies. So you can say, okay, there's these data attributes we're going to release, or this authorization. You can set up policies to say these service providers are going to get this one, these ones are going to get another one. So that kind of managed thing is what came together with Shibboleth to form SAML 2. And then there's Windows has got a Active Directory Federation services to get its WS security to talk to the wider world, OpenID. So I've drawn up a diagram to try and help picture where all these things sit. So there's three core elements to this process. You have, as I say, the authentication, the authorization, and then the actual data attributes, release of data attributes about people. And these authorization standards tend to cover different areas. So we've got ones that are just covering purely authorization, the ones I mentioned, the authentication. And then obviously there's numbers of standards for data attributes. So VCAR, Atom, Person is something that Google uses a bit. Semantic Web Standard for graphs of people relationships of data, FOAF. And it's only SAML 2, WS security that cover all three of these, cover the login, the authorization, and what data you're getting. So the way that they do it, it's the reason that there can be issues with the first two, OpenID and CAS, is that you need to establish a trust relationship, and you then need to encrypt the transport of the messages where you're logging in, and then you can actually log in. So these two boys in the middle, they do that. Potentially they can do that with three keys. So there'll be a key at the protocol level, your standard SSL, and then there'll be a key exchange to sign each of the messages that you're passing between you to say, you trust me, I trust you. And then there'll be another key used to encrypt each of the packets of information, so the XML will be encrypted as it's passed between them. They can use the same key for the latter two of those, but these two, they just rely on the protocol being encrypted. So there are issues about that where you may need whitelisting. So there's a kind of thing that's come up with OpenID where there's a list of trusted OpenID sites because you're not actually being able to establish a trust relationship with them. So I'll just run through the little process. Hopefully this is useful to people so they get the idea of how it works. So the initial bit is exchanging the key between the identity provider and the service provider. So this is more the way it works for SAML 2 or Windows version, but it kind of applies, the same process applies, slightly changed for OAuth, etc. So once you've done that, you go to login, you ask access of the service provider, which in my case will be this survey application, and it says no, go away, come back when you've got logged in. So you get redirected back to the identity provider, another site elsewhere, you log yourself in, you then get redirected back to the service provider saying, okay, I've got this ticket that says I'm okay, and then that ticket is used to send back again to the player you logged in to say what authorization or attribute release or stuff, what information should you be coming back with. And then that's when you get the, say your entitlement set or an OAuth token set to allow you to finally get in and do something. So that's the process. That's kind of a quick summary, a whirlwind tour of open authorization. So going back to the survey system, what do we need to do and what can you do, what tools are there available to do that with Django or general ones actually that could be reused for other web frameworks. So we've got a need to shibbolise, as it's called, which is a SAML 2 thing, apply that to universities that are using our system. And there is the case there that some of these customers will perhaps want to still use the direct boss login because maybe they haven't set up the SAML thing centrally, or they've got a bit of a sort of mess in terms of their identity management, and they just want to say, oh, we can't be bothered to look after that inside our organization. Too much work. There's also people that aren't necessarily related to these organizations who don't have accounts with that stuff, so they need OpenID access potentially. And there's users that, especially in our university sector, you may be somebody who's part of a local body that's in a membership of a number of institutions, or you may be, basically you may have multiple membership of these identity providers. So as a user, you want to go in and see, okay, this is my Durham access and this is my wherever Melbourne access or whatever if you're at a different institution across the world. And so it federates your access control for you as well as doing it from our perspective as a service provider. So what does Django give us? Well, green jelly babies in effect, but it's basically, it's pretty basic. You've got one size fits all, one type of user. There's just a basic users group and class level permissions. So there is a convention of adding a profile to a user to extend that slightly, but a group is literally just an ID and a name, so there's no categories, sort of hierarchy, there's no tagging of types of groups. And a user has, go back to the Venn diagram, a user has their authorization, their authentication, and some of their data attributes stuffed together in about 9 fields in one table, which obviously is not ideal. So with Django, you have things like isStaff as a kind of default. And it's been long recognized in the Django community that this is a bit pants, and they need to do something about it, but it's kind of a big debate over what they were going to do about it. So as far as I'm aware, this was based on my last reading of the Django developers discussion group. The solution they're going for is basically to move to that Venn diagram again, but this time by mixins. So you have a mixin for data, a mixin for permissions, and a mixin for authentication. So you'll get a default ones of those, but you can take a kind of core user identity model, and then you can provide a different mixin if you want to do different stuff with the data, or a different mixin if you want to do stuff with the permissions, etc. So hopefully you can get much more tasty variety of users or user handling in your application. So the next bit is going back to my sort of journey through trying to sort out this system and what was available as plugins to Django. So apologies for non-Django users because it's going to be a bit specific to this. But I guess there's general principles of how you do role management, permission management in an web application that can be applied to any. So the available things for doing the authorization, there was Django Guardian, which is tied into the current contrib auth, and it does do object level permission. So perhaps I should have, taken a step back. The requirements are that that certain instances of objects, so rather than just having all, say, pages, have a permission for users. Obviously, we want individual pages, so object level permissions to have permission to have assignment. So that was okay, but it doesn't do roles. So within Django, you have like the groups and the users, and then they separately kind of have a mapping of permissions directly to groups or users. So we want to move to role-based access control. So with that, you have groups or users or anything else, if you like, have a kind of thing of being a principal, and the principal can be assigned a role, and the role can map to permission. So it's a kind of standard authorization model that gives you a bit more flexibility. So anyway, the second option, it was more of a, so if you think of Apache where you might have access rules, allow this, don't allow that, it's kind of and from that you can produce something that authorizes to some extent like role-based access control, but it didn't seem to give me that much. And then there was Django permissions, which kind of gave me what I wanted, so that was good. So it's got a standard role-based access control, and it also has its own, so it uses the main users and permissions tables, users and groups tables, but it uses its own permission table. But that is kind of what I wanted, because the permissions table in Django tends to be filled with these automatic permissions when you add a class, and I didn't want class-based permissions, and so I could just ignore that table and use a permissions table that's about object permissions. And then there was the login. So Django social auth is the most popular because you can just sort of install and immediately have social authorization. So if you're connecting up to Google or Facebook and things like that, it just works. You don't have to do much. And then there are these ones that did more what I was looking for, SAML and the like. And basically, the Django shibboleth just wraps the direct specific SAML implementation of shibboleth. We've got PySAML, another one, but it kind of added ZODB and all sorts, which seemed a bit weird. And then luckily I came across this thing which wasn't even on Django packages at the time, but there's a bunch of guys in France who I should credit and should have contacted really and said, this is their names. I don't know who they are, but they produced this amazing system that does most of what I needed. So that was good of them. So this is a kind of like a whole federation management system. It happens to use Django as the front end for managing the federation of your authorization, so you can map together things that are using any of those standards, and it's a kind of level above a core C library that does the fast parsing and interpreting of the XML, the encrypted XML, and it's also got libraries for other languages as well. But yeah, that was pretty handy. So okay, I've got that part sorted. Authentic to and Django permissions. So I think I kind of covered. Authentic to did what I wanted in terms of the federation, and permissions does what I wanted in terms of providing that separation layer. So getting to the requirements, this is just the first half of my requirements. So I had, I need to map one or more authentication identities, to a user, as I mentioned, easily configurable, apply the policies, and the role-based access control. So just stepping through that, the authentic to does, sorry about the diagram, I don't know why I bothered with that one really, it's not, but anyway, authentic to does the thing of a number of different institutions mapping, so a user has a federation of their own access that they may have from the identity providers. And it allows easy configuration, so it just uses, the Django admin. But it allows you to do the job of exchanging keys and metadata. So the way it works is you'll get XML files released from either side, which will map, which will set out what attributes and authorizations being released, and also include the key that needs to be exchanged to provide the to ensure that you've got a trust relationship going. So you can just upload it. Well, first of all, you configure it, do a bunch of stuff, configure yourself as a service provider, and then that generates files that you can use as your XML that you give out to your identity provider that you need to exchange with. And then you can get their XML back, stick it in a form, blah, 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 and hopefully suddenly it all works. But it can take a bit longer than that, because unfortunately, as it's very generic, it can be configured for any form of SAML. Then there's a load of different parameters, so it does take a bit of tweaking to say get it to work with Shibboleth as opposed to Google SAML or whatever else. But it does the job, and it's also got a thing where you can set it up to like say nightly update the XML. Trawl it in and reset things, so which can be required if these things change. So you can apply policies as well, and so that allows you to do different things, because you've got, say, some institutions that can do the whole thing, do the federated authorization properly, and then you've got other ones that will just basically be using it as single sign-on, and you just have to have different ways that you're handling that. And then on to the fourth requirement, which was the permission. So this is just a thing where it's demonstrating, the UI for setting up your roles. So you've got a bunch of classes of content that you need to handle permissions with, and you've got a standard set of permissions you set up, and then for the author, you decide what those are going to be. So you have a number of different roles, and that allows you a much easier way of managing things, and as you'll see is kind of required to make entitlements, which is the sort of remote authorization, sane. Otherwise it would just be too complicated to specify it in detail for each permission. So what did I need to modify? Well, the roles were actually, it's kind of too over-the-top flexible, the original Django permissions. It's kind of it's designed that you could set a different role for each object. So you get a different set of permissions of role per object, which I felt was incredibly confusing. So I just wanted to set up a role set of permissions per class of object. But then you would apply that role differently for different groups of users to individual instances of the object. Authentic 2, well, it took a bit of hacky, because the way it assumed you did transient IDs with Shibboleth, it needed to basically use the transient ID for it to be accepted, but then it needed to switch and check if there were also persistent IDs. So to explain, you can set up an identity provider where you don't even have anything to identify who you are at all, and it only lasts for the session. So not much good for a system where you need to know who somebody is and give them authorization. Or you can have it set up, you just get an opaque ID, so you know nothing about that person, no data attributes or anything, but you have an ID that's persistent and will assign again against them when they come back in. So you can use that for the sort of thing of portalization, say, maybe if you don't want to know any data attributes. And then, from then on you can release as much information about them as you want. But it needed a bit of tweaking. So then I got to the second set of requirements, or I've started the second set of requirements, I should say. So this is to handle the fact that, okay, we might have a few of these institutions that are sorted out for their allocating authorization, but there's a whole load of them that haven't sorted any of that out. And potentially in the same institution, there may be some bits that are sorted out for authorization to bits, other bits that we need to be set locally. So there needs to be a mix of local and remote authorization. You need to be allocating access to people within service provider, as well as getting authorization attributes from your remote identity provider. And there's also the factor that because the identity provider is remote, then the person's lifespan and, well, not their literal lifespan, but their lifespan as a user in the organization is unknown to you, and also their authorization could be changed. So there's no way that you should be retaining the authorization that's been given to them beyond the session that they're logged in with, because they may log in tomorrow and all their rights have been revoked because they've done something nasty in the canteen or something. So then we get to the next query remote allocation. So there is the possibility that in order to provide a better management interface within your service, you can query certain attributes or maybe full attributes of users remotely, so that when, as an administrator, you're looking at a user, you can kind of refresh it to get back what's being allocated to it from the remote provider. And then we've got to make a decent user interface to do all this stuff with. And the lifespan management for people and their data. So roles acting as a separation layer. So we're hopefully able to reduce it to just a handful of roles, and that kind of think on that basis, and that makes things a bit more easier to cope with. Super user kind of out of the box. So we've got these other 4 roles we've come up with. And in order to allocate these roles to objects, it's easiest if we use a means to auto-create. So we have a kind of like a base class, which is groups, maps to these 4 groups. When you create an object, it has an associated set of groups, so that under the hood you can be throwing somebody into the authorship for this, say, survey, and that means they'll be put into the authors group that's been auto-created when the survey was created. And then we've got permissions checking, and it's where it gets a bit more towards where I'm actually going to show some Python code, hopefully. Wake you up a bit. So this is how I've implemented it as a decorator, and whether I've done the right thing with that. So I just diagrammed to explain what I was talking about with the various groups allocated to an instance of an object, the role that maps to those groups, set of permissions, etc. So for the remote role allocation, the way that it works is what you have is these entitlement attributes. So we kind of need to break those down into a standard format, which we can then split up and allocate access. So this is what we come up with. So you only really need the first few, because you may want to say for this particular, so given it's in their system, then users need to identify what this entitlement's about, because they might have ones that are internal about they can access the library after 8 o'clock or something. And so then you have the customer, in which case Cardiff, the role, the class of object, i.e. survey. So you don't necessarily need the identifier, so it could be that you're giving authorship to, in the Cardiff account, to all surveys to a particular user. But if you do use that, then you're giving it to a particular survey, and you may also need to help them manage things at their end. It may be they want to say, yeah, but don't let any students be authors of this survey. So you can then do exclude and a entitlement group to do that. So I'll almost get to the code now. And so this is how I want it to work. I don't want to have to put in anything complicated within the body of the code. I want to just have Django class-based views or Django functional views with a simple single permission. And for the class-based views, if you're using generic views, so they're like the list view or the update view, they inherently have objects associated with them. So if we've got the objects, we've also got the request for the view, then we've got the user. So all we need to do is provide the permissions. So we can just, on any view that's a generic view, we can just say, okay, I want this to only be accessible by users with an edit or lock permission. It works out the user has a role, the role maps the permission, etc. We find out whether they can actually get into that view. So it's calling check permissions under the hood, so passing the user the object and the permissions. And then it's getting those either from the temporary entitlements or the local get roles. As a reverse lookup is useful because you may want to say list all the surveys that a person has rights to view, for instance. So this is kind of like how you would apply it. As a class permission, that's a standard update view, so it's going to have an associated instance of a survey. Okay, so this is the final section, really, the code. And it's more a case of this. Look at this. This is what I did. What do you think? Does it make sense? So if anyone wants to say, "Oh my God, that's a terrible idea," please do so. So basically, the decorator, class underscore permissions, is a class itself, because by having a decorator that's a class, we can give it attributes which it can retain between decorations of the methods of the view. So there's two main methods that a generic view will have. The dispatch method that it first gets from URLs when it gets to the view, and the get context data, where it kind of pulls out the main data that's going to throw into the view in Django. And so we want to decorate first of all the dispatch method. We want to check if somebody can log in, and then if they do log in, keep hold of that user. And then we want to decorate the context data to say what permissions does that user have on that context data. So the way it works here is it kind of, I'm not sure I'd call it monkey patching really, because there is a standard method decorator way of applying a decorator. So instead of having the @ decorator applied at the top of a method, you can call that. So first of all, we call the outer decorator, which grabs the information. So it kind of works in reverse. So what has to be called first is login required. So login is the inside decorator. It's got login required. If they're not logged in, it will redirect them. It will come back. It will populate the request with a user. So then the request's got a user. Then the outer decorator just grabs that request data and sticks it into this decorator class, so it's available. And then the next thing that gets called is the get context data. And the get context data has this information related to what objects are associated with the view. And so then we've got the objects, we've got the user, and obviously the whole class is called with the list of permissions. So we've got the three things we need to check our access. So so the deck class bit is the thing where it's actually then passing that on to check for the permissions. So it splits it out, and if there's an object list, it works out. So standard attributes, which again, it could possibly change with different Django versions. Obviously, it needs to have a thing to, but hopefully they keep things the same. So you get the list of objects off your generic class that you have in Django, and then we go through them and check the things that we've set onto this decorator class. So we're checking the permissions, the request, and the users pass through. I'm going to pass twice, that's a bit ugly. I should clean that up, and the object list. And so that gets passed through to check permissions. So this is check permissions. So check permissions, if you're not a user, go away. If you're a super user, sorry, if you're required to be a super user and you're not, go away. And then the object list. So if you've not got any objects to check against in this case, go away again, because it's assuming you've got to at least have a permission on something, and it's kind of fail-safe in that you don't want to give access just because you failed to set the object list when there is actually some objects on the page. And then we do the entitlements call. So these are temporary attributes that we've been set from our federated authorization, the core of the talk title, and then we go on to take those entitlements and pass them to the actual check of the permission, which will, if the permission doesn't exist in the entitlements, will go on to check your locally assigned access. So the get entitlements, first of all, well, this is just the bit where it splits out the attributes thing, and these are standards for shibboleth to set entitlements, so it kind of passes this out from what's been set. And that set of names that I talked about, where it's boss, Cardiff, survey name. So this is just splitting that up, coming back, and passing it into here, and then we check if it's got them, and it does a lookup, and so comes back with the roles that it has, and the roles can then get passed on to be tested against. So the final bit is just passing it to the roles with a content type to determine if you've got the permission. So I think, saying that, I thought I'd reached the end of my... So the role entitlements check is just explaining in more detail, well, it's just doing in more detail the check of the breaking down entitlements as roles and what permission something has. So that is kind of as far as I've got, really. So I still need to do these last points. There's the remote allocation to sort out and get that back to populate the admin interface, make it more usable for administrators, and manage the identity lifespan and also data. So there will be things to do with data protection where after certain periods data has to be anonymized, a lot of it thrown away, and then there'll be a longer term lifespan removal of users. So I think that's pretty much the end of the talk. It's a wee bit early, but I don't suppose anyone minds that much. So I think we can move on to questions or suggestions. Cheers.
I have a little suggestion. In the slide before where you are going to use the decorator with the class and the call method.
Sorry, back.
Before?
The first one, yeah.
Yep, this. Have you ever thought about instead of using a class here, using a simple function and then setting the attribute of the function? I mean, you use there self.params. You can set the attribute of the decorated function as params, and then instead of using call, you may put the wrapper class inside that one as inner function, as a standard way of decorating a function. And I think this way you can optimize, because there you are using a dict, an under dict object, and classes variables. Plus some under functions. I mean, a function obviously occupies less than a...
Yeah, than a class, but I'm not sure how would you get the persistence of the data in a...
The persistent of the params attribute, you mean?
Yeah, so if you were setting, say, the request...
let's say permissions is a function.
Two separate method calls to the function, so the function would no longer be around when you were getting the context data.
Yeah, but those are all methods inside the rapid class.
The the Django view class?
Okay, so if you are going to set the attribute of set the attribute params in the object you are wrapping.
You could set it in that object you're wrapping instead, you mean, yeah.
It's a little intrusive, but I think you...
I guess you could, well, you'd have to name it kind of differently because it might have namespace clashing and stuff, but yeah, I guess you could. Set it on the view in effect.
Yep.
And but you'd still have to call it. The issue is that you're calling these at different times, so you kind of I don't know. But yeah, it's fair point. I guess as long as you were sure you would wrap both. So the problem would be that I wouldn't have my original kind of reason for doing it, which was that I could just have @class permissions, because I guess I would have to have one decorator on here, two decorators on
No, you can decorate also your class and then create the attribute in edit survey perms, but from outside.
Okay. Yeah, fair point.
Oh,
I guess
yeah, well, they are class decorators, so probably you will need Python 2.6 or something like that, but...
Okay. All right, well, I'll look into that. Thanks. Anyone else?
Maybe it's not a mistake, but the biggest problem with this decorator for me is that it modifies the class itself. So you should be careful while using it. Maybe you should get a subclass option or something like that.
No, well, that's what it's not. It's a class, so it was only modifying it itself. It wasn't modifying, but you were suggesting that I do modify the class and set the attribute on the class.
I was modifying to modify the class. I think it doesn't modify the class.
Yeah, because it's a separate decorator, so it kind of like, it's kind of, well, at least that's kind of confirmation. It's up for question as to which way of doing it, but this thing that it's setting is on itself as a decorator, not on.
Well, it edits the under name attribute.
Yeah, that's the. It's.
The under name.
Oh yeah, it's monkey patching in a way. Yeah. On the because it has to wrap it. So the way of wrapping it without doing that with an actual @ symbol on the function is that it grabs that method, decorates it, and puts it back again with those decorators on there. So it's kind of like yeah, I know what you mean. That bit did seem a bit ugly to me. I couldn't see how you could get around that without having to pull it out and have it explicitly the three different method decorators. But hey. Oh well, I guess it's a bit up for debate. If anyone comes up with a cleaner solution, anyway, that's kind of like we could have a votes on them. A bit like the new standard for users and groups in Django, as long as it doesn't take so long to decide wherever those were. Okay, is that? Sorry.
So, coffee break in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers, thanks for the question. At least it sets up to do a question.